I am going to be talking today about interventions to reduce the psychological consequence of disasters. And in particular, we're going to be talking about what is relevant evidence for deciding what works. So we're going to go into evidence base about evidence bases. The talk's going to be in two parts. In the first part, I'm going to describe inventories of effective practices to alleviate psychological and other health consequences of disasters that exist already. And we're going to look at these inventories of effective practices in order to relate the standards of evidence they used to the standards of evidence I heard at the poster sessions here during our workshop. Second, I want then to describe methods other than the randomized clinical trial that have a strong warrant as being acceptable evidence for learning what works. And we're going to use as a criterion that they are good substitutes for randomized clinical trials because they almost always produce the same results as randomized clinical trials when you look at the size of the effect of the intervention. Okay? The talk is not about lots of things. I've heard discussion of the last few days about descriptions you have offered about what happened after a disaster or during a disaster, or descriptions of the course of preceding a disaster, during and afterwards. This talk will have nothing to say about descriptions that you offer, even though there are course standards for better descriptions and worse descriptions. And we could have gone into those to help you come up with maybe better descriptions, but we're not going to do that. Nor is it about the way that systems operate in times of disaster. We're not going to go into systems research. We're interested here in the effects on individuals and how to alleviate those effects. So it has a more micro focus than the macro systems level we've talked about here today. This is not a talk about professional consensus about what we should do, because professional consensus is sometimes based on evidence, sometimes on less evidence, sometimes on weak evidence, and professional consensus is one way to operate, but it is, by the standards we're going to look at, not the preferred one. Nor are we going to be talking about standards for explaining why things happened. We're going to be talking about what happened to improve the psychological state of people. We're not going to get into causal explanation of why things happen. So we're not going to be talking about what are the causes of some effect that's observed. We're going to be talking about what are the effects of some cause that I'm trying to manipulate in order to alleviate the consequences of disasters. Right? So it is about what's acceptable evidence for learning the effects of causal practices aimed to improve the psychological consequences of disasters. This kind of a question, that way of framing causal issues, it requires an implementable package of components that might improve welfare. Often we call this a program. It requires, if it's going to get into an inventory of evidence-based practices, it requires that this package of services, this program, has been evaluated, and the claims have been made about the effectiveness of this program based on clear standards of evidence to claim that some relationship is causal. Now, there are many inventories of evidence-based practices, programs, and policies, right? International ones, all over Western Europe, United States, and crossing, obviously, national boundaries, which in science are pretty irrelevant, even though there are these national accommodations that have to take place at the margin with programs. We're going to see that these inventories differ in the standards of evidence they're willing to accept for what is real knowledge. And that's very serious that they differ. That says there is no canon of perfect science. They have a few important things in common across these different inventories, and it's very important to know what they agree about. They agree about one thing only, about what you should do, and they agree about lots of things that you should not do. And across these inventories, there are some things that some inventories say you should not do, and that other inventories say we bless and you might well do them. And those are the ones about which there's uncertainty and to which the second part of this talk is directed. So, these inventories of evidence-based practices all have standards for what constitutes acceptable and unacceptable evidence. They'll decide on a topic to review, let's say disasters or PTSD, what are the things you can do to alleviate PTSD. The staff who works for these inventories, and I'll explain some of them concretely in a minute, the staff who works for these inventories review all the relevant studies and decide which of them meet standards of acceptable evidence, and so they'll be included and will be reviewed, versus those that will not be included and will be rejected as non-science. And then the staff takes each of these studies, reviews it, describes it, gives the size of the effect that was created in an individual study, and then averages these effects across all the studies to give you a sense of the average impact of this attempt to alleviate the consequences of a disaster and the conditions under which the size of that effect varies. Okay? The goals of this are to direct present and future public and private funding towards those programs that work and reduce the consequences, and to reduce funding for those that are ineffective so that they can either go out of business or reform their central theoretical thrust. The second aim of these inventories of effective practices is to provide local providers of services with a rich set of options that you can go to see which work and might be applicable in your situation as a provider of local services. So for PTSD, for example, there will be different ways of reducing the symptoms of PTSD. And you could look at some of these and say, for my program in Jakarta, this isn't going to work, this isn't going to work, but this might, this probably would. And to give you, therefore, a range of options for dealing with the same negative consequences that you want to alleviate or to bring about positive consequences you're interested in. So it's a choice option. Right? And a choice implies local tailoring to local circumstances. So let me give you what is in the United States the best known of these inventories of effective practices. It's called the Coalition for Evidence-Based Policy. It's located in Washington. It has great links into Congress. It has great links into the White House. And its purpose, and here I'm going to read a little bit with commentary about what it says its mission is. This initiative seeks to assist policy officials, not local providers of services, to assist policy officials in identifying interventions that meet the congressional top-tier evidence standard. I'm going to explain what that is in a minute. Defined in recent legislative provisions. So this says Congress has defined what is evidence, right? So here there's a coalition of scientists and the policy world about what constitutes acceptable evidence. And it says in the recent legislative provisions have defined acceptable evidence as well-designed randomized controlled trials that show sizable sustained effects on important national outcomes. So it says only one methodology is acceptable, randomized clinical trials. And there's a public law which says this. This standard, now they're trying to generate political support for the standard, is consistent with first criteria recommended in a recent National Academy of Sciences report. So here they're going to approval from on high. The National Academy of Sciences in America is a very prestigious institution. So it's using criteria recommended by the National Academy of Sciences for establishing definitive evidence, definitive, not plausible, not likely, not possible, but definitive evidence of effectiveness. And two, it's a standard long used in medicine by the Federal Drug Administration as a condition for licensing a new pharmaceutical drug or medical device. So they're saying now that this standard works in practice. It's been long use. It's not just efficacious, it's implementable. In both, the next part is very important, in both social policy and medicine, findings in more preliminary studies, while valuable for identifying promising approaches, too often are not confirmed in more rigorous randomized trials. So they're saying that there is empirical evidence, that they don't cite or anything, it's just an assertion. There is empirical evidence that other approaches do not work. And if these other approaches do not work, then you should only rely upon that which demonstrably works for reasons of, we'll show in a minute, theory and practice. Now, of course, the second part of our talk is going to say that this last sentence is wrong, right? Because we're going to show some kinds of non-randomized experiments that routinely produce the same results as randomized experiments. But nonetheless, the assertion is, if it's not a randomized experiment, it is junk. 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 The translation of junk into your local language would be something like nonsense. A waste of the time of those people who've done the research. That's not a randomized clinical trial. A waste of the national resources that have gone into studies that are not randomized clinical trials and that make causal claims. So this is pretty powerful, assertive, very hair on my chest kind of perspective on science. The Coalition for Evidence-Based Practices makes two judgments about a program and its effectiveness. Top tier means the intervention has been shown in well-designed trials, preferably, not required, preferably conducted in typical community settings that produces sizable sustained benefits to participants or society. That's the top ranking. They have a second ranking near the top where the intervention has met almost all the elements of the top tier standards and needs only one additional step to qualify, but it has to be an RCT. This category includes, for example, interventions that meet all the elements of the standard randomized clinical trial in a single site and just need a replication trial to confirm the initial findings and establish they generalize to at least one other site, right? So actually, this standard means if you to do the same study in two sites, you can meet this criterion, right? So it doesn't mean two, as we'll see in a minute, two independent replications. Why is this exclusive reliance on randomized clinical trials? Theoretically, they are the only methodology that guarantees that the treatment and comparison groups are equivalent when the study starts on all measured and unmeasured attributes. So that says you have two samples that are drawn from the same population that are equivalent to each other and represent that population. And as I said before, they've been long implemented in practices since the 1920s in agriculture, the 1930s in medicine, the 1940s in psychology, the 1990s in economics, and they're just getting now into political science and sociology. They have a lot of scientific and political credibility, these randomized trials. Increasingly, they have a lot of credibility. Credibility is not the same as validity, right? But they have a lot of credibility in the media too. I'm amazed at how often I read in the media about randomized clinical trials done with life-saving drugs, right? With life-saving surgical interventions and the like, and it's journalists just toss off. This is the gold standard. Abby talked about, this is the gold standard, right? There's fool's gold too. Gold standard means relatively better. It does not mean perfect, right? So that's why the claim that the alternatives don't reach the same conclusions as randomized experiment is very important, because the gold standard means it's relatively better than the alternatives, not that it's perfect. It has a lot of assumptions you have to meet to do a well-implemented randomized clinical trial. And the limitations, obviously, of randomized clinical trials are that policies are less likely to be evaluated by randomized clinical trials than are neat contained packages. So there's lots of things that don't fit into the manipulability criterion that is intrinsic to experimentation. If you look at most topics of interest, there are very few studies that are randomized clinical trials. It varies by area, right? And there are very few that are community-based randomized clinical trials. So it's hard to judge the external validity of the findings. It's hard to describe the conditions under which they work. And then the last point is that in randomized clinical trials, there's a requirement of voluntarism. People have to agree to be in the treatment or control group before they're randomly assigned to those groups, so the results can never be generalized to people who don't volunteer to be in a study. Here's a second inventory of effective practices called the What Works Clearinghouse. This is, I'm reading now from its mission statement. We review the research on the different programs, products, practices, and policies in education. So this is about education. Then, by focusing on the results from high-quality research, notice high-quality research, which is emphasized, it's their emphasis, we try to answer the question, what works in education? So this has the same emphasis on, we want to know the effects of manipulable programs we can put in place to alleviate the consequences of disasters. Our goal is to provide educators with the information they need to make evidence-based decisions. They have two evaluative decisions that are positive. The study can meet the standards of the What Works Clearinghouse without reservations, and there's only one kind of study that meets the criteria without reservations, and that's a randomized clinical trial. We've been here before. A study can meet standards with reservations, and that allows three types of quasi-experiment, which we'll talk about later. Just have to accept for a minute there's something almost like an experiment. Quasi is the Latin for almost like. Some people call it queasy-experiment. Queasy is English for it makes my stomach turn. And if you love randomized clinical trials, they're queasy-experiments. If you're more open-minded, they're quasi-experiments. What they do is they rate each study, whether it meets standards without reservations or with reservations. They summarize the findings for all those that meet standards, and they give double weight to the studies that are randomized clinical trials. Then they summarize, doing a meta-analysis, to find the average effects of this intervention to alleviate PTSD or whatever, and they try to elicit the conditions under which a given program is more or less effective. They accept as evidence, therefore, randomized clinical trials, something we're going to talk about later for a little while, called regression discontinuity designs. They also recognize difference in differences designs. Here's where you have a group that gets the intervention, a non-equivalent comparison group that does not get the intervention. You measure each group before the intervention and after the intervention. So you look at the difference in the treatment group over time and ask whether it's different from the difference in the comparison group over time. That's why it's also called difference in differences design. And they will allow difference of different designs if and only if the pretest means do not differ from each other initially or after statistical adjustments to try and make them comparable. So they don't allow all non-equivalent control group designs, just those where there's no difference of pretest. And the other design they allow is a single subject design. This is the classical design of all science. This is the design you'd use in chemistry, biology, physics, and everywhere. And I haven't got time to go into it, but it is the quintessential design of science. Randomized clinical trials are only needed because we cannot do good single subject designs, because we don't work in a laboratory. We don't have the control over materials that a physicist has. We cannot create lead-lined rooms, vacua, and these kinds of things. We don't work with inert objects. So we don't use single subject designs, even though it is the essence of science. The What Works Clearinghouse recently did a report on an early childhood program in the United States called Head Start. It's funded to the tune of about $9 billion a year. It has been funded for 50 years now. So the nation's put the 2014 equivalent of $450 billion into Head Start. They did a randomized clinical trial of the effects of Head Start, where they randomly assigned children to being in Head Start or not being in Head Start. And that one study, which I designed together with Greg Duncan and Peter Rossi, that study was a randomized clinical trial. We did it selecting Head Start centers from all the centers in the nation. So we selected Head Start centers randomly, and then we randomly assigned children to being in Head Start or not. Excluded from this from this What Works Clearinghouse review were 98 other studies. So 98 studies were declared to be junk, and only one study out of 99 got accepted as science. The rest got consigned to non-sciences. Excluded were, for example, sibling cohort designs, in which you have a brother or sister, or two brothers or two sisters, one of whom goes to Head Start and the other of whom does not, right? So the controls for many household factors, controls for some genetic factors in a sibling control design. But what it doesn't guarantee is that the siblings have identical pretest scores. So it's out, it's not science. Excluded was one regression discontinuity study, which was very important, of the 30-year impacts of Head Start 30 years later, which came to the same results as the 30-year impacts of other psychological programs like Perry Preschool. And even though it came to the same results as these other early childhood interventions, and so to a Bayesian statistician, bore you to death, it comes with a background, right, in other studies, but it's still treated as junk. Its relationship to these other studies is excluded. So the assumption being made is that there's no value at all to the 98 studies that are declared to be junk. Right? Here's another inventory, and I'm going to stop the inventory soon. I could go through many of them. This is one on which I serve on the board, which is called Blueprints for Healthy Youth Development. And the Blueprints mission is to identify evidence-based prevention and intervention programs that are effective in reducing antisocial behavior and promote a healthy course of youth development. So it's about youth. This particular inventory of effective practices has 3 evaluative decisions other than junk. The first is a promising program, and a program is declared promising if there are 1 randomized clinical trial into it, or 2 high-quality quasi-experiments, high quality not being defined and left to the judgment of the 7 or 8 reviewers, who are all, I think, superstar methodologists. Or it can be considered a model program. It's a model program if it meets, there are 2 high-quality randomized clinical trials, or 1 high-quality randomized trial plus 1 high-quality quasi-experiment. And also if the intervention impact is sustained for 12 months, so it has to have a long-term effect, and then there's a designation called Model Plus, which meets the same criteria as a model program, plus there's an independent replication of the results by independent researchers who have no stake in the program intellectually or financially. So this is adding new criteria. There have to be long-term effects, and there have to be independent replications. And right now, the 48 programs that are promising, 12 that are model, and 2 that are model plus. The big daddy of all of these inventories of effective practices is the Cochrane Collaboration in Medicine, which you should all get to know about. It is very, very, very influential. It started in Britain and is now worldwide. Within the Cochrane collaboration, randomized clinical trials take the center stage again. Other designs are allowed in. Some quasi experiments are allowed in, but they're down-weighted. They do have strategies for mitigating effects of disasters. And there are many reviews. So if you were to go into, do we have the time? 9. No, I'm going too slow, aren't I? Why don't you go and Google Cochrane Collaboration? It's spelled up here. Can you Google Cochrane Collaboration, please, if you don't mind? I don't have mine in front of me, so. Cochrane Collaboration, and it opens to a first page. Somewhere up on the top right, as I remember, is a queue for queries, right? If you write in there the word disaster, it will tell you the studies that have been done on the consequences of disasters. Pretty good for a conference on disasters, right? And if you then go and cancel that, wipe it out, and put in PTSD, right? Post-traumatic stress disorder. And then you click on post-traumatic stress disorder, you'll see that there are lots and lots of meta-analyses of different programs designed to reduce the symptoms of PTSD. So here you have something which has done all your work for you in a way. It is biased towards Western countries because they've done all the studies. But here is a list of things that at least the Cochrane Collaboration says, and you have to critically appraise it, but at least the Cochrane Collaboration says this much we know about alleviating PTSD. We can hear Abby talk about Abby's way of doing it, but Abby's is only one of many ways of doing it, right? And with all due respect to Abby, while she knows a lot, she comes from Minnesota, and Minnesota has a special line on these kinds of things, given Forgatch and Patterson, et cetera, Here you have the array of science, right? So what you have is a chance to know what might work, to know what might suit your circumstances better, to critically appraise that knowledge, and to be able to say, how might I have to adapt this in order to make it work for me in my situation? So that's the potential advantage of these inventories. As you can see, they all agree on the superiority of the randomized clinical trial, and they disagree about what else could qualify as acceptable. And whatever else qualifies as acceptable, it will not be given the same weight as the results of randomized clinical trials. Also, they agree on many ways of learning about what works that are not acceptable to any of these inventories. First of all, no qualitative research will work. Now, to philosophers of science, qualitative research can indeed rule out all alternative interpretations of a causal claim. In falsificationism, there is no requirement that the work be quantitative or qualitative. Right? But nonetheless, these inventories will not allow qualitative research. So if you produce a report using qualitative research, you would not get in, you would be considered junk, a waste of your time and a waste of money. I'm not saying that. I'm telling you these inventories say that. But there are standards. For example, in ethnography, there are recognized standards about what is better and what is worse ethnography. Right? If you read the work of Howard Becker, it is straight out of Karl Popper as a falsificationist theory of ethnographic practice for ruling out alternative interpretations to whatever knowledge claim you want to come up with. But we haven't dealt with them here, right? So obviously we haven't been able to give feedback about standards for qualitative research. These inventories all refuse to include professional opinion or professional consensus. There may be some very famous body of people who have said that this works or this works or this works, like a National Academy of Science report, but that's treated as junk. It's just opinion. It will not include any structural equation modeling studies at all, and I had 4 or 5 structural equation modeling here. And the reason for that is that it used to be called causal modeling when Juris Cogn-Serboom started it, but after 15 years they gave up the name of causal modeling and came up with the more neutral name of structural equation modeling, because they realized that if you change 1 or 2 of the variables in the model, the results are going to change, usually. That the results of your model are contingent on everything else in the model being true. Not just the arrows between 2 variables, but the strength of the association in those arrows. So it's such a narrow conclusion. It says if everything in this model is true, then this arrow that I'm interested in is true. But that's a very, very weak read for any conclusions. Only in one field is structural equation modeling still used. It's been rejected completely in most of sociology, all of political science, all of economics. Only in certain parts of psychology is it still used, right? And the reason for that is because psychologists love to come up with multiple mediating models of things. Or psychologists want to look at the causes of effects rather than looking at the effects of causes. And I don't know why it's hung on in psychology, but it has. But if you're a comparative methodologist, you would want to write a sociology of science paper on why it's persisted in psychology. It rejects all kinds of before-after studies. I studied this community before, I studied the community afterwards. Rejected. Won't come in. It will not look at a difference of differences designs in most of these unless the pretest means are absolutely identical. And they'll rarely be identical because they're not equivalent groups to start with. All sibling cohort designs and institution cohort designs are all rejected. So these inventories are very clear in what they reject. And unfortunately, it means that they've rejected almost everything we've talked about in the poster sessions that has made any claim to be effective. This is what it works with disasters. Right? So this is a very, very, very serious issue. This mismatch between the standards of evidence that have been incorporated into these bodies of knowledge of what works, and the mismatch between those standards and the standards that I have seen. I hate to be blunt, and I'm sorry if I'm coming across like an ugly American, because I'm an American, but I'm not ugly. Anyway, but I'm just bluntly, and that's very American to be so blunt, forgive me. I can't be somebody I'm not, right? But bluntly, the standards of evidence that I saw are not the standards of evidence that are incorporated into any of the inventories that are well established. Okay, so what? I've just said it. I had many claims here about what works, but no single study I heard about used methods that would be acceptable to any of these inventories of effective practices. If you do not accept these standards of evidence, and I'm not saying you should, I'm just describing what they are, then it's your, I think, moral and scientific duty to construct different ones. Now, there are different ones. I could give you a lecture on different standards of evidence developed by groups that reject these standards of evidence. I'm going to briefly mention them at the end. Whatever alternatives you come up to with, you already know in advance they're not going to have much legitimacy with the bodies of people who socially determine what is science. So section 2 of this talk. Which non-randomized experimental methods work and have their own warrant for being acceptable because they generally produce results like an RCT. So we have a methodology for knowing what works. It has to have statistical theory, plus it has to have empirical evidence. So we're going to talk about something called a within-study comparison, which provides the empirical evidence about what alternatives to randomized clinical trials usually give the same results as randomized clinical trials. These studies, there are 72 of them, follow the following kind of a methodology. Anyway, this is called a 3-arm design, and what you have here is a randomized experiment where you have a control group and a treatment group that are randomly formed. Since we're all psychologists, we all know what this is, right? This is the thing. Then you produce an estimate of the size of the effect here, and that's called, we'll call the intent to treat effect that I think Zappy talked about, right? So this is our best estimate of the truth. All of these inventories of effective practices have said this is the best evidence about the truth. Now let's imagine we have a non-equivalent comparison group, right? Drawn from a different population of people. Now, these people in this comparison group are different from the people in this treatment and control group. These two groups start out equivalent. This group is initially different from them because it comes from a different population. So these may be people from one city. These may be people from a different city. And because they come from a different city, they are different as a population from those in the randomized trial. And the name of the game is to try and either choose a study, choose a city, a different city, which is very, very similar to the one in the randomized clinical trial, and or, not either or, and or, to try and think through what are the differences between these cities that are likely to affect the study outcome, and then to measure these and control for them statistically using analysis of covariance or propensity score modeling or whatever. The analysis doesn't matter very much. So the name of the game is then to say, look, if I have chosen a comparison group that's as similar as possible and have tried to understand all the ways in which they're different, I can then create an estimate of the size of the effect by studying the size of the treatment effect using the very same treatment group linked to the adjusted comparison group, adjusted for the non-equivalence. And here I'll come up with a size of the causal estimate, right? In this non-experiment, I'm using the same treatment group as an experiment, but have a non-equivalent comparison group. I can compute using the non-equivalent comparison group in the same treatment group an estimate of the size of the effect. If the size of the effect here in the non-experiment is the same as the size of the effect here in the randomized experiment, then I've created a non-experiment that gives the same result as the randomized trial. Right? It's very important to understand the logic of that. You're comparing two causal estimates, one from a randomized experiment and one from a quasi-experiment, and asking do they give the same results. Notice they hold the treatment group constant. It's the same treatment group in each design. So you could cross that out. What you're asking, in essence, is, do I get the same result with the randomly formed control group and the adjusted non-randomly formed comparison group? So most of these within study comparisons take this form. The second form is a bit more complicated. It's called a four-arm design. And you get a population of people. You randomly assign them to being in a randomized experiment or a non-experiment. Statisticians like to call this an observational study, or a quasi-experiment, or a non-experiment. But what happens is you have the same population of people, and you randomly assign them to being in a randomized experiment or a non-experiment. And then in a randomized experiment, you compute the size of the effect. In the non-experiment, and it could be a non-experiment because an administrator says which group get the treatment and which get the control. Or it might be that people self-select themselves into getting the treatment versus control. It could be either administrator assignment or it could be self-assignment here. And you adjust for the differences between those who self-select themselves into treatment versus control, or those that administrators send into treatment versus control. You make these adjustments, right? The nature of which I haven't mentioned yet. You make these, and you then compute the size of the effect here in the quasi-experiment, and then you ask, is the size of the effect in the randomized experiment the same as the size of the effect in the adjusted non-experiment? And if the results are the same, then you conclude that this kind of quasi-experiment produced the same results as a randomized experiment. So these two forms of design with the same logic behind them are what is used for determining which non-experiments give the same results as experiments, right? And we're going to very quickly go through these because we're running out of time. There are 72 studies to date like this. The first non-RCT method that's been compared to the RCT is called regression discontinuity design. I'm going to explain it in a minute, but before I explain it, I want to tell you that in 12 of the 13 studies that have been used, this methodology I just described to compare results from regression discontinuity to randomized experiment, in 12 of the 13 you get the same results. So that makes regression discontinuity seem very good. And then there's a variant of regression discontinuity we're going to call comparative regression discontinuity. There's only 4 such studies, and you get the same results in 3.5 of them. So what is this method that reliably produces the same results as a randomized experiment? And can you use it to study disasters? So here's the design visually. Let's say that here you have a variable which is the distance from the epicenter of an earthquake, right? And let's imagine that in your country you have very little psychological resources, so you have to have a method of rationing those resources to see who should get them. So this is distance, and let's say this is very close to the epicenter here, and this is more distant from the epicenter here. And you've got resources for a certain amount of people, and you've only got resources for people who live within 5 miles of the epicenter. It may be 10, maybe 15, maybe whatever. Or it could be an individual risk, the extent to which somebody is traumatized. This variable can be anything. It's sometimes called a promiscuous design. You know what promiscuity is? I'm not sure I know what that is. No. It's called the promiscuous design because you can use anything here for the assignment variable. What counts is the following, that there is a score on this variable, let's say distance from the epicenter, such that everybody who lives within 5 miles gets psychological treatment. Everybody who's more than 5 miles away does not get treatment. So that whether you get treatment is defined by your proximity to the epicenter and nothing else. Or it could be individual risk factors. Or it could be the size of your family. It could be anything here along this variable. But what counts is something that also characterizes a randomized clinical trial. I gave you the conventional statistical rationale for a randomized clinical trial. The groups are equivalent to start with. That actually is not the statistical justification for a randomized clinical trial. It is that the process of assignment into treatment is completely known. You get treatment based upon a coin toss and nothing else in a randomized experiment. Here, it's the same principle. The principle is you get treatment based upon your proximity to the epicenter and nothing else. Now, of course, in the real world, and this is called a strict regression discontinuity. In the real world, you'll get some people who live closer but don't get it, and some further away and get it. That's what we call fuzzy regression discontinuity, and you can handle fuzzy regression discontinuity fairly easily. So this design allows you to make a causal inference here at the cutoff. So let's say whatever this variable is, mental health functioning, people who live closer to what's going to be the epicenter have a regression line here that characterizes the relationship between the assignment variable and the outcome. Right? The further you live, the closer you live, the worse your symptomology. And then afterwards, there is still a regression line, but there's this discontinuity in the regression line at this point. What else could account for why there's a sudden jump in psychological functioning at 5 miles away? What's the difference between people who live 5 miles away and 5.1 miles away? Very little. Chance. And chance is what makes a randomized experiment work. Right? Chance allocation. So this design is explicitly endorsed by the Warwick's Clearinghouse, not endorsed by the Coalition for Evidence-Based Practices, but is a strong design. I'll go over this next one. The second method, which has been used, is called comparative interrupted time series, and it's been evaluated relative to the results of randomized clinical trials. And comparative interrupted time series works in 10 out of 11 studies, especially with matching, which I won't have time to go into. But here's what this is a study we just completed in the United States to evaluate a program called No Child Left Behind in Education. And in interrupted time series, you have a time frame, which is going here from 1990 to 2010. It could be a time frame within an hour or 30 minutes. It doesn't have to be annual, it doesn't have to be long like this. Here is when the new law was passed. The new law applied to all public schools in the United States. So, since it was a national law and applied to all public schools, what comparison group can you come up with? Private schools. There are two kinds of private schools in America, Catholic schools and non-Catholic private schools. You get the same results for each. Here you have the public schools. Before 2002, when the law was changed, they score below the private schools. Private schools get better students. When the law is changed, what happens is that the public schools go up by more than the private schools. So there's a change in mean at the time point of the intervention. And what also happens is that here you can see that the two groups are growing slightly apart. Afterwards, they're coming together. So what this law did was it closed the gap between public and private school performance in the United States. Now, there are reasons why this would not have been interpretable very well without having the non-equivalent time series provided by the public schools. But these designs almost always, 10 out of 11, produce the same results as randomized clinical trials. And these are harder to do in your countries. They're easy to do, done all over Scandinavia with their national registers. They could be done in Japan a lot. They could probably be done in Australia and New Zealand. But it requires that there's this inventory of data on people and places when you use archival data, so it's harder to do. The third method is this difference of differences designs, of which there are two versions that produce the same results as randomized experiments. Okay. So what does all this mean? Let me conclude. This talk is about meta-standards, your standards for saying what are standards of evidence. Right? That's what the talk's all about, meta-standards. The inventory standards I talked about are the top end for scientific prestige. If you want to get published in the best journals, you got to do those things, or you're dead. What you're dead means you won't get published. It means you spend a lot of time. It means if you care about these standards and these gatekeepers of scientific prestige, then you're not going to get your foot in the door. Right? The gatekeepers are savage. Now, you may not care about those gatekeepers and those standards, but then you've got to come up with your own standards that you can justify. I do not have time to go into these other standards, but you'll see them represented, for example, in public health standards for drawing causal conclusions, which are looser for the most part, as well as explicit standards for monitoring and explicit standards for implementation, which are important parts of intervention too, right? And not given as much attention as what works. The public administration in many countries has different sets of standards for what works than the ones I've just outlined. And if you go to web pages for National Public Administration Association of the United States, you'll find different standards. The American Evaluation Association has different standards, and they're trying to integrate them into these top-tier prestigious scientific standards. And there are standards, as I said before, for qualitative research, which particularly interest me. And you could have imagined a workshop like you've done here, in which we went into better standards for description, right? Better standards for monitoring, right? Other standards for saying what works. But we didn't do that, obviously. So, the conclusion. Obviously, there are different sets of standards. With the posters, I had causal claims, but no use of methods that weren't causal claims in the science. The best is the RCT. There are other methods I went over too quickly that often reach the same conclusions of RCTs. Those you have to take very seriously. And there's a lot of other methods that are non-experimental that do not work by these high prestige, high stakes standards of international science. So we have to learn how can these methods be used in disaster research? And we have to ask the question, should these standards be used? Thank you.
So my question is it feasible to do in natural or disaster research? Because the main point in RCT is that we have to have the similar baseline from the both group in order to make sure that effect size that we observe came up from the intervention itself, not because of demography or another confounding factor which might relate it.
Thank you for that good question. It's a necessary condition for interrupted time series that you have the time series to be interrupted by the intervention, right? So if you haven't got the measures, you can't do it. But let me note that there's a very, very, very long history of doing interrupted time series over very short periods of time, collecting your own data, as opposed to interrupted time series using administrative archival data sources. For instance, in the United States, almost all the research that goes on in special education and all the research that goes on in industrial psychology takes a different form. What it does is you measure one person, right, at 3 or 4 times, blop, 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 and it could be half an hour apart. Then you introduce an intervention, and then you measure them afterwards. And you get a control person whom you measure, and you introduce the intervention at a later time, and then measure again, right? This is called single subject design. Or you can take a group of people in a village and measure them on a daily basis. And the hardest part in disaster research is predicting when a disaster will happen. That's the hardest part, right? But this design does not require observations a year apart. It does not require archival data. There's a very long history of doing it over short periods of time, where the researcher collects his or her own data, and where different villages or different individuals or different work groups get the same intervention at different times. Right? So that's all I want to say. It's very hard as a methodologist to talk in general like this, because as a methodologist, I need the specificity and concreteness of your situation and your problem, and then we can design something. Designing in a vacuum, right, is hard, because comparative interrupted time series will often not be possible, but it will sometimes be possible. And your job is to know enough about methodology that you can use a design for this concrete research situation you are in, given that many other designs would not be appropriate. You need to be a hunter. You need a bow. You need a quiver. And your quiver has to have many different arrows in it. A randomized clinical trial arrow, a regression discontinuity arrow, an interrupted time series arrow, a difference of differences design arrow, and I can give you many more arrows. And you can choose which one you use to shoot your problem, but it's going to be specific tailoring. What's wrong is to say, I have a method, let me use it. What's right is to say, here's a problem. Which method goes with that problem?
Tom, I'd like to admit that I am dependent to my statisticians and to my methodologies. So forgive me for my elementary questions. Right now, I am in love with SEM, doing the models. I'm a frustrated fashion model. So let me just try the SEM model.
Pobrita.
I'm curious with SEM. So we have the model already. Okay, now we came up with the model. Now we want to test the effectivity of the model. What do you suggest? What method could best fit to measure the efficiency and effectivity of the final model? I use the mediation analysis to my study, with my study, and then my hypothesized model, like work-related organizational factors and coping strategies to improve quality of life in terms of compassion fatigue and compassion satisfaction and family functioning. And my hypothesized model worked out at the final model. But now I'm on the trend of validating the effectivity of the final model. So it's under social science with industrial psychology and compassion fatigue and compassion satisfaction. Thank you.
Thank you. So your endpoint is compassion fatigue, and you have a model of multiple causes of compassion fatigue and of multiple relationships between these multiple causes of compassion fatigue, right? That's the structure of what you have. So the first thing is to be sure of what your model can do and cannot do. Right? Your model, you can test whether it is plausible. Right? Whether you can estimate the parameters, the values, the numbers you put on these arrows. Right? What you can't know is whether the model is true. What you cannot know is whether if you change the model a little, you would get the same or different results. You can't know whether if you introduced a different variable from the outside into this model, whether it would continue to hold at all. So these results are incredibly fragile. And it's because they follow an epistemology, a way of knowing, that is called verificationist. They attempt to say, here's my model, is it plausibly true? Can I verify the model? That's not how science works. Science works in a falsificationist way to say, how can I rule out alternative interpretations to this model? So if you're a SEM modeler, you could do a fairly good job of saying, does model 1 work better than model 2, work better than model 3, work better than model 4? So if you set up your problem as a comparative SEM problem, then you can answer the question of which works better. So you've now rejected 3 models. You've learned something from the negative results. The model that's best, you know is best. You still don't know whether it's true. You still don't know how fragile it is to introducing new variables. You still don't know how fragile it is to doing this, that, and the other. But at least you've ruled something out, and that's the way science operates. And you'll do better, of course, as anybody will tell you, by having multiple measures of each of the constructs in your model, because your model is about variables that you give an abstract construct name to. Your model is not about that name plus unreliability. So you want to make the unreliability equal across all the variables. And the best way to do that is make the reliability very, very high, because you don't want to confound the variable with its reliability.
Thanks, Tom.
So, you know, if we talked about SEM, if we'd done a methodology of SEM, we could have talked in detail about what is better standards for doing SEM research versus the usual standards in the usual journals, which are junk. Forgive me for being so strong.
Thank you.
They're not wrong, but they're just not helpful.
Sir, I noticed that you mentioned that an example would be a junk research would be qualitative. So I would just like to clear if there is any way that qualitative research could be useful in terms of developing a program or intervention just based on the qualitative design. Thank you.
I'd like to make 2 answers to that. The first is, for developing a program, it's a necessary condition. It is really very, very, very important for developing a program. I think it's very important in testing the effectiveness of a program. Half of my budget goes on ethnographers. I mean, they're very expensive people, ethnographers. You have to pay their salaries. And then you have to be sensitive that they require intensity of observation. Then you have to realize that requires the reliability of observers. So you need 2 or 3 ethnographers, and you have to put their narrative accounts together. Then you realize that the best kinds of standards for ethnography are those that are not like the thick descriptive ones of Gertz, which are fashionable nowadays, but rather the more falsificationist ones of Howie Becker, which says you go into the field and you construct a tentative narrative about what is happening, what's leading to what. So what's leading to what has causal implications. Then you go back home and you sit and reflect and say, if that account is true, then which other consequence would follow because that account is true? What would I expect to see and not see? Then you go out into a second round in the field, and then you observe, do those other things happen or not? And then you revise your initial account of what is happening. Then you go back home, and then you reflect upon your revised account and say, well, if my revised account is true, what would I expect to see now? And then you go out in the field again. So it's this iterative process of hypothesis generation, hypothesis revision, data collection, hypothesis revision, data collection. That's a very sophisticated epistemological theory of qualitative research as an alternative to RCTs. Now, none of the groups that I talked about would accept it. It's also a very good way of doing qualitative research to try and explain what happens in an RCT. It's probably better than questionnaires and sticking some mediating variable into a SEM model. I would trust careful ethnography more. So I'm a great fan of ethnography, but if you're going to use slap-happy visits into the field and call it ethnography without a structure of rationale and warrants and epistemology for it, that's half-assed. That's not real. Forgive me for being blunt. This is not thoughtful ethnography, and it'll rarely be a substitute if you're making causal claims for RCT.
Thank you, Tom. More questions?
Other standards covering replication?
One of the, I talked about, the Whatwoods Clearinghouse has a standard for independent replication. It's very, very important. Independent replication, not replication by the same people or their students. The Coalition for Evidence-Based Practice requires that there be replication at 2 sites. But there can be 2 sites within the same little study, right? So it's a piddling criterion. Now, Congress is about to pass legislation in the United States calling for more replication and more analyses of robustness in social science in particular. And the National Science Foundation is going to start a big new program together with NIH on replication in research. The problem has been that basic researchers do not want to do replications. It's hard to get them published. It's not novel. So we've been working on crafting new ways of being able to build replications into studies that extend the past findings. And that's the way to go, because then we'll have more replications and people will accept it. Right now, the professional associations in America are fighting Congress about replication because Congress is not putting up money for replication. It's saying it's got to be done because we don't trust social science, but it's not putting up the money.
Abby, you got something on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really important point because what it says is that we have enough knowledge about what works in general, but what we need to do is take that and see whether it's generalizable, right, to across cultures and contexts. And I think the point here is that we have, in PTSD and in disaster research, we have some good evidence, but people like you need to take it and say, okay, now let's extend and test this in my context. One other point quick, which is that you didn't mention one other clearinghouse which I think could be very valuable to these guys, which is, again, it's American, but it's NREP, N-R-E-P-P,
Yes.
which is the National Registry of Evidence-Based Programs and Policy, Programs and Practices of the American Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration. And that is where a lot of the PTSD treatments will be reviewed. I don't think you can search under disasters, but you can certainly search under PTSD. And you can also search under trauma. So.
You have to be very careful here because some federal agencies in Washington have set up their own websites of effective practices because their own programs were not being declared effective by the independent ones. So so it's very politically embarrassing, right? To be, for example, to be in youth justice, what works to prevent drug abuse and acting out by young people. We have an agency in the United States, several agencies responsible for that, and none of their programs were appearing as evidence-based programs. So they set up their own websites with lower standards that were particularly tailored to allow their own studies in. They've got to be very careful. But I would like to take a little bit of an exception to the first thing you said, if I may, Abby, which is that we know what works. If you say that we know what works and we have to study its generalizability, that's a rather odd statement because science requires generalization as a necessary condition for knowing what works. Right? So that's why some of these inventories of effective practices require independent replication, right? And that's only over one or two circumstances, usually. It's very hard to know when is enough generalization to say that we know that this reliably works. Having worked once is hardly evidence that something works. If you said that to a chemist or a biologist working in lab sciences, they would laugh at you, right? Because the requirement is that something robustly replicates in my lab and somebody else's lab. Otherwise, it doesn't exist.
Right, but it's right. I agree, and so I probably should have added the words "what works" under certain circumstances and in specific situations. But it's better than starting with no evidence. That's the problem, I think, not just around the world, but even in the US. People say, well, I've been doing this, and people like it, and therefore this works.
Yeah, but the problem is a very deep ontological one. Ontology is the assumptions you make about how the world is. Right? If you believe that the world is organized around main effects, so anything that worked once is likely to reliably work again in different circumstances, right? So the world is not constructed out of statistical interactions, just main effects, to give it a statistical language. If you believe that the world is constructed that way, then Abby's position is great, makes good sense. One sort of evidence means it's highly likely to generalize. But if your ontological presumptions are that the world is a complex place, and that things work with certain kinds of people but not others, things work with certain kinds of providers but not others, if things work in some settings but not others, if some things work with one version of this treatment but not other version, if some things work with one way of measuring youth violence but not another way of measuring youth violence, if you believe that the world is set up as a complex network of relationships, then Abby's statement doesn't hold. Now, I don't know how the world is. We can't know the ontology of the world, but that's the argument. Because you're already an ontological unilateralist.
You have given one example of life skills training especially.
Good for you.
Yes, you said like this doesn't work or there is no enough evidence, or what is that? I didn't get that condition.
I had it on the slide,
yeah.
but I was getting all these signals here, so I omitted that slide. It said that the following: if you look across these different inventories of effective practices, how much do they agree with each other? That was what it was. And I was saying that there are certain programs that have come up as stellar on all of these programs, right? And some that have not. Life skills training is the poster child for effective replication. There have been 30 or 40 studies of life skill training, all randomized clinical trials, all around the world, with different populations, with the intervention being done by life skills folks or not life skills folks, with different measures of the outcome, and they almost all give the same results. And there's another program like that in the United States which often comes to the same result, called success for all. Right?
So one
Please show your appreciation for Tom again.